we are seeing an increase in anti-Semitism, not just in France, but really all around the world right now, also in the United States. To break it down, I'm joined by Professor Chuck Freilich, a former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor and Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies and Miriam Institute. Chuck, thank you so much for being here. We're seeing this rise in anti-Semitism following the October 7th massacre. Is this something that we could have expected following one of the deadliest days in Israeli and Jewish history? Now we're seeing an increase in violent acts against Jews around the world.
Yes, we are. Tragically, it's happening. And to be perfectly frank, tragically, it was to be expected. It's a sign of our times. Hate seems to be percolating around the world in a variety of contexts, and certainly when it comes to Israel. We had the dubious pleasure of having a large amount of support the first few days of the war, but things have turned around dramatically. And as military progress proceeds, the price that we pay diplomatically and in terms of anti-Semitism has been rising.
We can, since the onset of the October 7th massacre and the ensuing war, we continue to see these pro-Palestinian protests, many of them gathering hundreds of thousands. Just yesterday on the UK's Armistice Days, 300,000 pro-Palestinians taking to the streets of London. However, now we're also seeing it seems to be an increase in anti-Semitism marches. So as though the rhetoric is maybe changing on the worldwide level condemning Israel, we also are seeing more and more people speaking up against this rising anti-Semitism.
We are, and we saw a number of universities in the U.S. taking some measures in the last few days, notably Columbia, which has long been Columbia's always been a radical campus, but we saw the president there taking some measures. So yes, people are protesting this, and to the extent that, trying to distance themselves from this, to the extent that the protests against Israel take on an anti-Semitic nature, that produces something of a backlash around the world. But things are going to get worse before they get better, and we have to prepare ourselves. And the government might be doing more to position itself, even if just from a PR point of view, certainly substantively, but to position themselves better so that it might somewhat mitigate the international response.
What exactly can or should the government or authorities be doing to hone in on this problem that we're seeing?
Well, I think the government could be presenting more of a positive horizon for once the war ends, talking about what kind of positive solution we would like to see to the conflict. But this government has a problem doing that, or won't do that simply. And I think if the prime minister was less focused on his own personal problems, and was projecting a more favorable image both in Israel and abroad, things might be a little better, but it wouldn't turn around the picture. The anti-Semitism, the anti-Israel protests are going to grow until the war is over and afterwards, and we have to brace ourselves for it.
Meanwhile, as we're speaking, Chuck, we continue to see red alerts sirening in northern Israel, so it's a clear sign that the war on the ground here in Israel continues to rage on. As I said, those red alerts. So even as we're seeing everything that's happening abroad, it's all because of what's happening on the ground here in Israel. I'm curious, because you mentioned when you see some of these protests talking about anti-Israel rhetoric, but then it quickly turns into anti-Semitism. So when people say anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, how are they either different, or how can people differentiate, or is this not proving that they truly are one and the same?
Well, I think anti-Zionism has basically become another way of speaking for anti-Semitism. But that doesn't mean that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. One can legitimately disagree with some of what's happening now. I think most of the criticism that comes is from people well-meaning, I don't know if it's most, but let's say from the Jewish community and from people who are friendly to Israel. There is criticism. Are the tactics we're using the appropriate ones? And I don't think we've done made a sufficient effort or done it properly in any event to present the picture, to explain to people why things have to be done. I'm talking about the military campaign, why it can't be done otherwise. I mean, I've had conversations with friends and colleagues and said to them, okay, I understand your criticism. Now give me some practical suggestions how we could do it otherwise. And that's when people get stumped and don't really have a good answer. We could also, again, if we present a positive horizon for what's going to happen after this war, that would also help.
What do you mean by a positive horizon of what happens after the war?
Politically, in other words, it's not just to defeat the Palestinians in Gaza. Of course, that's the immediate objective. But does Israel have any long-term plan for how to solve the issue? Now, I think one of the tragedies of this war, to be frank again, is that the two-state solution is either dead or it's certainly postponed for a long time. I don't think the Palestinians are qualified in any way to negotiate with us today and to achieve a state. That's, of course, assuming that we had a government that was willing to do it. But the constant emphasis on just all the negative and just the war and not holding out any hope for something better afterwards. And if the prime minister is not willing to talk about a two-state solution, what is he willing to talk about? Not just the war, not just that the massacre of the 7th was a horror, but that can't be the end of the story. What does this horrific event lead to? Just more massacres, more bombardment of Palestinians? Where are we going? We have to win this one. We have to win it decisively, as far as I'm concerned. But what happens the day after?
And as the unknown for Israel remains a big question mark, still, even in this state of war, some people are saying that Israel is safer for Jews than it is for them to be abroad. The Ministry of Immigration is preparing to see an uptick in people immigrating to Israel because of these anti-Semitic incidents we're seeing abroad.
Well, let's just say that I'm underwhelmed by statements by the Ministry of Immigration and various other government sources. As far as I'm concerned, this government has lost all credibility. And there are cases where they may actually be saying something which is true. I don't know about this specific case. Whether there's truth to that is really debatable. Yes, there's anti-Semitism around the world. I think that most Jews don't feel it. They get up in the morning and they live a perfectly safe and normal life. Most people in Israel, even with the war, get up in the morning and they don't feel it personally, or a lot of people in Israel. But let's just say that it's a debatable assertion.
Well, Professor Chuck Freilich, former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor, as well as Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Miriam Institute, thank you for providing your insight into everything that we are seeing internationally right now.